Hello? Can you guys hear me? Can you all? Sweet. Good to see you guys. Got a little candle going on. Nice little ambient scent. Does that work? Ambient scent. Sweet. Well, we'll go ahead and wait until 4 to give people a chance. Hello. Awesome. I got a lot of people showing up. Let me see if I can figure this out. Participants. Pop out chat. Oh, this is fancy. I've never done a live stream directly through YouTube before. I like this. Oh, separate chat. Ambient set does not travel via internet. It will one of these days. It's like Wonka vision. Thanks, Little Art Productions. I'm going to try and read the questions out much more clearly this time. That was a understandable complaint from previous live streams because I keep forgetting, although I think YouTube should preserve the live chat, but I keep forgetting that listeners in the future won't be able to see the questions, so I'll make sure to read those out clearly. I have a lot of really good questions that people have asked. Some of them are very difficult, so we might be here a while. I don't know how long I'm going to go for. We'll go until my voice is dead, and until I feel the impending doom of having to study for a physics exam tomorrow set in. So, trivia. Harmonic trivia. What chord is this? I know, the Super Bowl. I just realized the Super Bowl is happening today because I'm so oblivious to sports. So I figured since all of you are likely oblivious to sports too, being musicians and composers, minor, major 7. No, good guess though. 7 sharp 9, also good guess. You guys can totally feel free to submit questions in the chat. I am taking patron questions that have been submitted on the Patreon on a post I made or a private message via private message first. I'm going to answer those first, and then I'm going to answer questions that people asked on the previous video I made announcing this live stream and the little video I did of the conversation I had with Danny Elfman, Spider-Man, and just some other questions that I've sort of picked up and haven't been able to really, that would be too long to answer in a comment. Once I get through those, if we have enough time, which we should, then I will answer all of y'all's, to risk sounding like a southerner, all of y'all's questions on the chat. How old am I? I think I'm 23. Yeah, I'm 23. I'll be 24 in February. February 14th is my birthday, Valentine's Day, actually. So the chord, by the way, was major 7 flat 13, right? Or like E major on top of C major. That's the classic Star Wars chord. So, all right, great, awesome. Let's get started. Already a great turnout. These things always surprise me that people just show up. All right, so I'm not going to list the names of the people who asked questions because some of them requested that I didn't, and I couldn't get permission from all of them, so I figured it'd be just easier to just ask the questions. But if you really want credit for the question, let me know if you asked it, and I'll put your username or real name in the description of this video after it's done. All right, so again, thanks so much for coming. I really appreciate all of your support. I'm quite excited about this. Okay, so question number 1. What is your least favorite John Williams score? So it's a good question. It depends upon what you mean by least favorite. I think there are some scores that are, you can judge a film score by its material musically, or you can judge it by its effectiveness. And I think Williams, for all of people's criticisms of him, has always been able to, from a very young age, probably because of his extensive work in television and the studio system, he's been able to produce an incredibly functional score that very effectively suits the aesthetic direction of the director and perfectly syncs up with the film. It isn't too obtrusive. And so you can find scores of his that don't have as much memorable thematic material, which, I mean, he's written so many memorable themes and even multiple themes within a given franchise or single film that, you know, it's not like every composer can just come up with gold every single second of every single day or even within the same film. That being said, as far as a lack of memorable thematic material in recent years, I wasn't a huge fan of the Adventures of Tintin score. It was a super fun score. It worked really well. I liked the harpsichord and the aesthetic of it. It just didn't have a lot of super memorable thematic material for me. Also, the latest Star Wars score I wasn't that overly impressed with. But I think a lot of that had to do with, I mean, this is like the 8th Star Wars film he's written. I don't know if I would be able to continue to be fresh if I were writing that many movies in the same franchise, reusing thematic material. Even some of his earlier stuff is really nice and really interesting, like the Images, which is a sort of avant-garde score that he did back in the, I don't even know, like 50s or 60s. And there are, like, the Iger Sanction is a great score that he has. I know that's not answering the question, but I can't think of a Williams score that I hate, because I think I think he's such a good craftsman that, unless maybe I were to go back and find some student stuff or early television work, he's such a good craftsman that his scores are never bad. They're always, at the very bare minimum, functional, and they work well, and he has a good technical eye and sense of craft. But if I had to say, like, of the scores that are more popular, I'm also not a huge fan of, and you guys are going to kill me for this because I know a lot of you, this is your favorite score, and it's more of an aesthetic, subjective problem. The Q Flight to Neverland, you know, do do do. I like it. I don't have anything wrong with it. It's a nice bit of thematic material, and it's very childlike and innocent. You'd think I like it because it's just straight up Lydian, but it feels to me borderline cheesy, right? And there are people have different levels of what emotional joy and vulnerability that's expressed in pure diatonic form. What level of that gets to the point where it's sort of too much? It's like a cake that's too sweet. It's a fine line. And my tolerance is higher than most people. I know all kinds of fellow composers and academics and people who dislike John Williams because it sounds cheesy to them. And some of them don't even like a lot of music that many people wouldn't consider to be cheesy. Like Samuel Barber's Violin Concerto, I wouldn't consider that cheesy by any stretch of the imagination. But I think that's where a lot of the avant-garde composers that really like the dissonant, sort of like kind of heavy metal version of classical music, the really, really dissonant, like Aaron Copland's Organ Symphony, you know, Samuel Barber's Piano Concerto, that type of stuff, which I enjoy as well. Some people temperamentally, I think, like that darker stuff a little bit more than like the optimistic stuff. I like both. I tend to be more optimist than dark. But anyway, so not to give too long of an answer to that question. So if I were to give a specific answer, probably The Adventures of Tintin is, you know, one of my least favorite John Williams scores. There are probably some that I'm missing out on. Also, Minority Report. Although Minority Report was decent. I do like War of the Worlds, though. That's I noticed that's a score in the comments where people commented that it didn't have enough memorable melodic material, but I don't see War of the Worlds, especially that realistic kind of War of the Worlds, as being a particularly effective. I don't see that as being a landscape to craft tunes like he normally does. But there are all kinds of really memorable moments in that score where he invokes an entire choir singing atonally, scoops and things mixed in with the orchestra when the laser beams of the aliens disintegrate, the people running through the streets in dust, the types of ostinatos and time signatures and sort of set theory, atonal combinations that he has going in the intersection scene and Escape from the City. So I actually really like the War of the Worlds score. Anyway, this is a very specific question. I'm not sure how well I can answer it because it's so specific that I feel like it needs context. Someone asks, how do you know when to have the bass trombone play the same part as the tuba part, play a trombone part, or play its own part? I mean, it's a good question, but the trombone, like many instruments of the orchestra, is very versatile, right? You can organize instruments according to how more or less functionality they tend to have. in the orchestra. And the trombone is a particular instrument that, because it was a later comer, right? You know, Mozart using the later symphonies, and it's one of those instruments like the clarinet that wasn't really integrated into the core instrumentation of the orchestra until later. So if you look and examine back to antiquity the corpus of classical music, you don't see a lot of really versatile writing for the trombone. Part of that has to do with the limitations of the instruments. Like the strings were perfected back in like the 1600s, right? The Stradivarius violin, it hasn't gotten better since then, whereas saxophones and clarinets and oboes, and especially the percussion section, are constantly have new keys and octave keys and technical adaptations to continue to make the instruments better and better and better. And marimba, sorry, I'm looking at the spikes. Is everyone experiencing lag? I have pretty good internet here. It's like 25 megabits. Modal lag spikes. Is it good? Can you at least hear my voice clearly? Is what I'm saying unintelligible? Let me know in the chat. Okay. All right. I'm going to assume it's okay. Let's hope that it isn't repeated before. But, okay. As long as you guys can hear my voice, I'm not going to be giving too much audio illustrations. Anyway, continuing to talk about the trombone, not to get into a whole big discussion about the advancement of the technological developments of the instruments as an orchestration topic, but the trombone is a very versatile instrument. So specifically to answer your question, it's very common for the trombone to double the tuba if you want a really meaty sound. The tuba, okay, so the brass can be divided into conical brass and cylindrical brass, right? So flugelhorn, French horn, tuba, those are all conical brass. Cylindrical brass would be like the trumpet and the trombone. Cylindrical brass tend to have a brighter, sort of buzzier, brassier sound. The conical brass tend to have a warmer, more sine wavy tone with less overtones, right? Conical just means that the diameter of the tube continues to get slightly larger and larger and larger, and then flare out at the end, whereas a cylindrical brass instrument, the tube is the exact same diameter all the way wrapped around until the very end, in which it flares out into the bell. So that has implications with regards to the timbre and sounds of the instruments and how they blend together. So I see the tuba and trombone as being complementary, like different colors, like orange and blue, you know, like complementary colors, and they work very well, both in unison and in octaves because of that. But they're also completely different, right? If I want to have this sort of raspy kind of low Lord of the Rings kind of chocolatey, rich in overtones kind of bomb kind of thing, then I would want to use bass trombone and not use tuba at all, and only just have like sort of trombone choir playing the thing that they're playing. Maybe have a couple of bassoons doubling in. If you only have two trombones and a bass trombone, you can have two bassoons and stick it in there. And if you deal with the dynamics, that can work out quite nicely. Tuba and trombone works really well at unison. You get a really sort of, you get the brassiness of the trombone, but you also get the warmth and body of the tuba, because that's why you only need one tuba. The tuba is more felt than heard, sort of like the double bass, right? It has this warmth that sort of fills the room, but you don't hear it sort of kind of spike through the way that like a bass trombone or a cimbasso would. So again, I can't really answer your question unless you give me like a specific context. I think as long as you're careful with dynamics, as long as you understand the different dynamic proclivities of different parts of the range, as long as you understand how good your players are, and as long as it's balanced with the rest of the orchestra, and as long as you know what you're going for aesthetically. Do you want something warmer? Do you want something colder? Do you want something that's very clear and sonorous? Do you want something that's sort of muddy and rattling like a, you know, rusted iron cage? If you know what you want and you know how to achieve that and within the different instruments, then you can make a unique combination for a given passage of music to give the exact effect that you want, right? If you're writing low pedal tones, then that's a different consideration that has to be made, because the different brass instruments have different abilities to play low pedal tones. And so you may, if you write a line that fits well and this also has to do with like slide positions on trombone. If you write a line that fits well on the trombone, it may not fit well on the tuba, and vice versa if it's particularly virtuosic. So that's another consideration that's made. So I don't want to go too long into that, but hopefully that gives you kind of a start of maybe the types of places you have to look and continue to act to refine your ability to write well for the trombone and the tuba and that. Okay, great. It seems stable now. Sweet. Hopefully that answers that question, at least mildly sufficiently. This one's hard. This one's very hard. Do you think music can be, you know what I'm going to ask, do you think music can be objectively good? If music is perceived so subjectively, how can we judge it by objective standards? I'm glad this question was asked because this is something I thought a lot about. And like any really difficult philosophical question, is a question that any good musician is going to continue to think and ponder about all the way up until the very end of their life, and never quite refine their views on the topic. I don't want to go on a huge rabbit trail and answer this, but there's a sense in which everything is subjective, and there's a sense in which everything is objective, okay? And this goes for the aesthetics of all art, right? So if I listen to a piece of music or look at a color, there is an extent to which the sort of predisposed biological proclivities of my brain, which isn't a blank slate, has the capacity to experience certain types of emotions and a tendency to interpret certain types of stimuli into certain kinds of cognitive outputs, right? And but there's also the whole nature versus nurture thing. If you have individualized experience in the surface level, if you grow up in a given culture, in a given time, with given parents, listen to certain musics and have experience with music growing up, then that's going to color and shade the way in which you interpret something, right? So I sort of think about it like this. When everyone listens to a piece of music, they experience it in some sense the same way, right? They're not experiencing different sound waves. They're experiencing objective frequencies. And although people's hearing, auditory apparatus might be of differing levels of quality, and some people might be able to hear some frequencies, with regard to the interpretation of dissonance and consonance, people experience things the same thing. There are also some disagreements about the fine lines that you draw between, for example, what intervals are consonant and what intervals are dissonant. But the idea that consonance and dissonance exists is not something that's merely sort of arbitrary, right? It's not relative, because the relationship between what pretty much everyone that you will survey, and this is something that also that I've asked all kinds of people about from different cultures and different places. I've tried to be like, how do you think about this without sort of putting words in their mouth? And I found that there's some common consensus. So like a minor second, for example, right? There's this very simple reason why that sounds dissonant comparatively to, for example, the perfect fifth, right? And notwithstanding our equally tempered tuning system, the reason why the perfect fifth sounds more in tune than the minor second is because it appears earlier in the overtone series. And so the C, if I were to play C and G, right, C's first non-fundamental overtone, or rather third partial, is the G, which supports the G that you're playing in actuality. So they sort of interlock together like this. And it's one of the reasons why we like tertian systems of harmony. It's actually not because of thirds, it's because of fifths, right? So if I play a C major 7, that sounds like nice and interlocked and consonant, right? But if I just play the C and the B by themselves, it's very dissonant. Why is that the case? Well, people often say because of thirds, but we have a mixture of major and minor thirds. It's actually because of the fifths, right? The fifths overlock. C and G support each other because of the overtone series, and E and B support each other because of the overtone series, right? Which is why if I voice it like this, fifth, 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 also sounds great. But if I voice it like, for example, this, still sounds great because this is dissonant here, but it's fifth and fifth. But if I do something like this, where we have a fourth instead of a fifth and then the fifth, right? There isn't as much sort of connective reinforcement, although you're still going to get a fifth. A fourth, you're still going to get a fifth inside of a fourth, right? And that's another issue, not to derail this conversation, but that's another issue with that is another issue with the contention of the Renaissance composers like Palestrina of the perfect fourth being considered to be a dissonance. Because although it doesn't appear in the overtone series with regards to the relationship between the fundamental and the overtones, it still appears in between the upper partials and thus is going to support itself. Think about it this way. If I play C and G, C on top of G, so like a perfect fourth, right? The C's first overtone is C, an octave above, as you know, and then G, right? Okay, and then the G that is a fourth below, it'll probably be easier if I, right? So this C produces this overtone G, right? Okay, this G produces this overtone, and also this overtone, and also this overtone. So even though this sounds to be dissonant because the D produces an A, which is dissonant with the G, right? You're still hearing this. So what you're hearing is this, right? Which has some dissonance, but also a lot of reinforced consonance, right? It's the same thing with the minor third. People are like, why is the minor third sound consonant? Why isn't it imperfect consonance if it doesn't appear in the overtone series for a long period of time? And when it does, it's completely out of tune with the equally tempered toning system. The reason is because the minor third appears between partials, right? C, C, G, C, E, G, E, G, right? And again, it's 14 cents out of tune with our equally tempered tuning system, but it's the same thing as the major third, okay? So to get back to the conversation, there are some stimuli which are perceived to be objective, right? Dissonance as opposed to consonance, and you can disagree about the subtleties, but generally has to do with complexity of waveform ratio. The more complexity the ratio is of two interacting waves, the longer it takes for the waves to get back in cycle with themselves, and the more it appears to be dissonant. Okay, and so the higher the level of complexity, the more chaotic it is, and it's sort of like yin and yang, right? The more complexity, the more yin, and the more sort of simplicity, then the more yang, right? And then the two interact with each other. You don't want to hear a piece of music that's completely just utterly consonant. You don't want to hear a piece of music that's completely dissonant. When stimuli are produced, there is a level, there are different levels of abstraction that you can think about the types of things that arise when you listen to a piece of music, right? So we can't escape certain musical artifacts of nature. Like thunder has a certain characteristic timbre to it. And so when you play timpani and bass drum, boom, right? You can't help, even if viscerally in your subconscious, feeling some sense of thunder, right? And what does thunder mean? Thunder means lightning. Lightning is dangerous, right? So thunder is sort of something that often precedes something crashing, right? So it gives you a sense of impending anxiety and maybe of doom, right? Or it also gives you the sense of excitement, right? Because there are some people like myself, like pluviophiles, who like rain and like thunder and are sort of excited by it, right? So there are certain programmatic surface level associations between certain kinds of timbres and nature and the overtone series, and we make those associations. So because I'm a human and you're a human and you're a human and all of you guys are humans, there's a degree to which what we are experiencing when we listen to music is objective. And that's why we can communicate about music, and I can talk with a friend and be like, hey, you know, I feel this. And most of the time, if the conversation is general enough, we can agree about it. If we start getting into the details of specific programmatic stories that we think of when we hear a piece of music, or maybe this lullaby scares me because I first heard it in a horror movie when I was, 10 years old, but you didn't, and it was a lullaby that your mother used to sing to you. So there's an extra, it doesn't mean that the music doesn't sound happy. It just means that for me, the happiness sounds disingenuous and artificial, and there's another layer of sinisterness underneath it, if that makes sense. It's not that I'm hearing this lullaby and hearing and interpreting something totally different from you are, but there's another layer of abstraction underneath that's causing me to interpret the stimuli in a certain way, okay? So the question is, if music is so subjective, how can we criticize music? How can we say that music is objectively better than other music? There are different levels. There are also different types of good and bad, right? Good and bad is just getting into the whole, ethical value judgments and moral philosophy, which can be, as you all know, very, very difficult. And I don't want to get too far down that road. But so there's the craft, good and bad, right? In other words, if given that there is the presupposition that there's a goal that I want to write a piece of music that sounds as performed by live players as I want it to sound in my mind, well, then you have to consider certain technical idiomaticisms of the instruments, right? The French horns can't play this high. This can't do this. And some of that is on the technicality, the technical physical nature of the instruments, right? And sometimes that changes. Sometimes instruments over the years can be improved such that they can play things that they used to not be able to. And sometimes it has to do with the players, right? the players, the New York Philharmonic, when, as you all know, when they first played the Rite of Spring in 1913, could barely play it because they weren't used to reading and processing all of these polyrhythms, and the bassoon wasn't used to playing in its extreme high register. And now the bassoon solo from the Rite of Spring at the beginning is now an audition excerpt for, high schoolers auditioning into college. And so everyone's expected to play it, right? So there's a degree to which even the objective is subjective with regards to time period and context, okay? But all that aside, with regards to the aesthetics of music, you have to some extent figure out what you want your demographic to be, okay? And you also have to some extent presuppose what the palate of your listener is going to be, right? Because to some extent, if you taste really good wine or really good cheese or have a really great burger, if you start getting access to really, really good food, your conception of what a good meal is going to raise. And so then you might not be as satisfied by a lesser burger, right? And there's a degree to which that is a kind of a snobbery, right? Certainly, but there's also a degree to which that artists want to continually push the high limit, the glass ceiling of what is perceived to be good and bad. But the analogy breaks down, right? Because flavor is also subjective. Some people really like really spicy foods. Some people really don't like spicy foods, and so there's an aesthetic matter of taste there. But but there's a general balance of flavors, so that you don't have much of individual flavors. That every good chef and every good lover of food can agree upon, that regardless of what your aesthetic preconceptions are about what flavors you like and dislike, a good meal at a bare minimum, we can all agree, has some sense of balance in the flavors. And there are other aspects like the aesthetic, the way that the food looks, right? And so when you write a piece of music, I think how you can define it to be whether or not it is a good or bad piece of music, assuming that you fit the baseline level of it is well orchestrated in the sense of craft, right? You need to consider whether or not it is able to produce the given aesthetic effect that you want to produce in either as many people as possible, or at the very least, as many people within the demographic of people that listen to your music, right? So, for example, I wrote the third movement of my first symphony, right? And I knew that the way that I approached writing that was going to come across to some people as esoteric and obtuse, because it's building on a framework of 20th century harmonic techniques and emotional frameworks and layers of abstraction. Not that I'm saying it's any more complex than anything else, but it's building on an emotional framework, not just intellectual, but an emotional framework that if people who are listening to it are used to hearing a given type of music that I produce, or used to listening to another given type of music, when this doesn't fit their preconceptions, then they're immediately going to dislike it because it doesn't fit their preconceptions about what music is, right? And I think you can expand your conception of what music is supposed to be. I don't mean that you should be so open-minded that your brain falls out, right? Because there are obviously, there's an extent to which if music can be anything, music doesn't mean anything anymore, and the term loses itself all meaning. But you can stretch. So it's all just about yin and yang. But if you're writing a piece of music and it is for a given function, it's for a media function, or if you're writing a piece of music that's going to be accessible, I think you can write an excellent piece of music that isn't necessarily the most progressive, innovative, complex, or out there piece of music in the world, but it can still be incredibly effective, and it can be a good piece of music, good being defined by your personal conception of what your goal for the piece of music is. So that's what I would say. And that's generally been the only way that I've ever been able to improve myself, is I say, okay, well, what do I want to accomplish with this music? Okay. And then I write the music, and then I see whether or not it accomplishes amongst people what I want it to accomplish. And if it doesn't accomplish that, I consider it to be a bad piece of music. Even though some people else might, it's not even that I consider it to be a bad piece of music. You got to get more down to detail. I consider this phrase worked out really well, this maybe not so much, the formal proportions, and you sort of get a sense of, if you have an idea of what you want your music to be like, then you can continue to perfect that model, and you'll never get quite perfected. And I feel like that is where composers will eventually land upon their own personal sense of style and aesthetic. It's not that they're trying to artificially create a new style of music. It has to be something that arises naturally, and it shouldn't be something that's a mask that you wear that's fake, right? It should be something that is the result of your goal to try and write music that you want to hear that doesn't currently exist in the world, right? And there's a degree to which exploration of a given style can really allow you to familiarize yourself with it, right? There are like historians that sort of have an immense breadth of knowledge, and they can sort of connect the dots at a very high bird's eye level, but they don't know a lot about an individual time period or individual, individual person, whereas someone else might spend their whole life studying Stravinsky or studying the atom, right? And those are two different intellectual temperaments, and I don't think there's anything wrong with that. And some composers are like that too. Some composers, especially good film composers, have to have a very broad understanding and versatility to be able to write in a plethora of different styles to serve the film that they're writing for in the different contexts, but maybe they don't ever really, really, truly master something individually. And this is, I think, a category that you can put composers into. There are composers, and you've heard this before, there are composers that who are more progressive and innovative and constantly searching for the new. And then there are composers who focus and hone in on a given style. Like Mozart, I would consider to be someone who focuses and hones in. I mean, there are certainly aspects of Mozart's music which are innovative, but compared to other composers, he didn't really innovate that much, right? He just wrote extremely well and absolutely, utterly perfected, which is why he often repeated himself. He utterly perfected that classical style of music, that Occidental classical style of music, to a degree that arguably no other composer did before. Whereas Beethoven came along and wrote and just blew the roof off the place and tried out all kinds of new things. And so there are moments in Beethoven's music, and I'm going to be crucified for saying this, but you all agree, Beethoven was not no composer is a god, right? Composers are imperfect, right? And Beethoven has transcendental moments and has written masterpieces which are flawless, but on his journey, because it was more adventurous than Mozart's journey, I would argue, Beethoven made a bunch of mistakes and sort of dirty, kind of loose pieces of music, and so that he could sort of find and hint on and sort of, mine everywhere dirtily so that he could find diamond, right? Whereas Mozart didn't ever really write a bad piece of music, but he didn't write a piece of transcendental music as often as Beethoven did, if I can make that subjective personal argument. And I think the same thing is true with Ravel and Debussy. Debussy is a composer who I love listening to, but a lot of the music that he wrote is just kind of, he's so exploratory and out there and trying out new techniques and novel ideas. It's always novel, but it doesn't always it's not always perfected or polished, right? But when he hits upon something like Prelude to the Afternoon of a Faun, it supersedes and becomes sort of transcendental. And I don't mean transcendental in the New Age sense of the world. I just mean that it transcends the human being Debussy. It touches on something that is sort of all great pieces of music all touch on, whatever that thing is up there. And Ravel is, again, the opposite. So Ravel is a composer who didn't write a lot of music, and a lot of the music that he wrote is very clearly in his style, although there are certainly, he has his impressionist music, his neoclassical music, he has music where he incorporated jazz. He was definitely an assimilator of different styles, like in his piano concerto. But generally speaking, Ravel wrote his style of music and perfected it. So you listen to Daphnis and Chloe and Allegro, an Introduction for Harp and Strings, and Gaspard Illanuit, forgive me for poorly pronouncing the French names, but his music is always incredibly polished, and he really focused and honed in on a particular style, but he wasn't as creative as Debussy. So I think Debussy at his best is better than Ravel, but Ravel is consistently better than Debussy, right? And again, that's all completely and totally subjective. But to answer the question, because you could go on this forever, but to answer the question as simply as possible, music objective and subjective, I think you should judge whether or not your music or parts of your music or phrases, you can look at it at different levels of abstraction, what components of your music do or do not achieve what you want it to achieve given a response in your audience. And you can trust yourself, or you can trust your audience, or you can try to align yourself with your audience. And that's what I do, right? To a certain extent, you can't take in everyone's opinions because they're all so disparate that you will never be able to create anything coherent, because if you're trying to follow everyone's advice all the time, you will never be able to write anything, right? But if you only ever follow the inside of your brain, right, you're going to become so antisocial and away from reality that you're going to write things that no one can understand because you become so distant from society. So what I try to do with myself is try to figure out to what degree my own personal tastes are aligned with my audience, and then pick out the audience that is aligned with my personal taste, and then use my own intuition to produce something that I think other people will like. And if other people don't like it, then I rework my conception and figure out what the cognitive dissonance is between my own conception of my music and my audience's conception of music, right? And again, there's a degree to which that depends upon occupation, right? If you're sort of like an academic ivory tower composer, you just want to write music for yourself. I don't think there's anything wrong with that, right? And I don't think there's anything wrong with being a composer that just churns out trailer music. Not there's anything wrong with trailer music, but churns out trailer music all the time, over and over and over again, and it all sort of sounds the same, but it's all functional and it all works perfectly nicely, right? So, and then I kind of want to be somewhere in the middle. Although lately over the years I've gotten more into the art side and less into the functional side. So you have to figure out what kind of composer do you want to be, and then once you figure that out, and so you can't just sort of decide, right? You have to be open to the possibility of discovering what kind of composer you want to be, and then judge the level of quality in your music and constructively criticize it along that axis, which has subtleties that are subjective. But again, given that you are a human being and the people who are listening to your music are human beings, there is inevitably going to be some continuity and overlap, right? So it's just the whole process of composition and developing one style is disentangling the subjective and the objective. If that makes sense. Okay, next question. What is your favorite Gustav Mahler symphony and why? That's hard. I like a lot of his symphonies, and I also don't like a lot of movements of his symphonies. I think he goes on for too long. Well, I shouldn't say that. You got to be in the right mood to listen to Mahler. Mahler is not just a composer that you just sort of put on in the background while doing stuff. You have to it's a saga. Each symphony is like, as he said, a world in and of itself. I would have to say probably the ninth. The ninth is a symphony that, especially the first and fourth movement, is the symphony that probably substantively has affected me emotionally more than any other movement. Although I really do love the first symphony. I love the da 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 da. It has so many nice, beautiful pastoral tunes. I love the second movement. I love the love theme from the fourth movement. I love the sort of Frere Jacques double bass solo and the sort of Jewish dances from the third movement. So I do love the first symphony. So I'd say probably first and ninth are tied. Ninth is more serious. First is more sort of relaxed. So I guess they can be sort of yin and yang and exist simultaneously as my two favorite Mahler symphonies. And there are obviously movements, like I love the third and I love the fifth, and obviously the Adagietto from the fifth is just an inimitably beautiful piece of music. So if you want to talk about individual movements, then that might change. But as far as the most substance of the entire symphony that I enjoy, it's got to be 1 and 9. How do you go about learning, developing, and becoming fluent with chord progressions in your instrument? So there are two components to that. One is, can your fingers play what you know you want to play, right? And that's just a matter of practicing Hanon and scales and just working on finger dexterity, right? That's just the technique of the instrument. There's the intellectual component of understanding, okay, I have this abstraction of the major chord, which consists of a major third and a minor third, and I understand that intellectually, and I know how to build that, but I also know what it feels like and sounds like, so you have to integrate it into your ear, so it's not just this thing that you play, but you actually feel it and can hear it, and use your ear and intellect to work in tandem with one another. But then there is the technical detail of producing that in all 12 keys given a particular instrument, right? Because piano, I play a C major chord and it's 3 white keys. I play a B major chord, it's 1 white key and 2 black keys. I play a flat major chord, it's 2 outer black keys and 1. It totally changes depending upon the context. And so if I'm thinking about a particular progression, let's say let's just go with 1 3 6 4 in Ionian. Right. If I'm going to transpose that to any other key, I just moved it to D flat major. It fits totally differently. And so you have to familiarize yourself with all 12 keys technically, right? If you're asking how do you expand your harmonic language, then I would encourage you to listen to, because you said chord progressions, right? And there's nothing wrong with having a repetitive 4-chord progression. It's sort of like a minimalist idea where you have some aspect of consistent repetition and then you explore on top of it. It's sort of like having in Hindustani music, or in like modal jazz, where you have a sort of tonic pedal and then you explore the various the characteristics of each individual scale degree on top of that, a very slow harmonic rhythm. That's a thing, and that's great, and I love music like that. But if you want to expand your harmonic language so that it can adapt itself throughout a piece of music and not just be chord progression, chord progression, chord progression, chord progression, new chord progression on the bridge, and then back to the previous chord progression, then I really think you need to have a fundamental understanding of tonal harmony, of tonic and dominant, and all the various substitutions and the Western music, and then expand that to modality, all the 7 different modes, and then expand that to an understanding of set theory and the symmetries of the 12 equidistant tuning systems. Like when you study set theory, you learn like, the various the axis of symmetry around 6. And so, if we assign integers, not to get into this, but 0, 1, 2, 0 through 11, on any given starting pitch, we have all 12 pitches. You have different interval cycles. So 1 and 11 gives you the chromatic scale, right? 2 and 10 gives you the whole tone scale, right? 3 and 9 gives you the fully diminished 7th, right? And then 4 and 8 gives you the augmented chord, and 4 and 8 have factors of 2, which 2 and 10 have factors of, which is why there are 2 augmented chords as subsets of each whole tone scale. I know this sounds complicated, but that allows you to understand, and then you understand why the diatonic modes even exist. Why is melodic minor not just as good as the diatonic modal collection? It's like, well, it is just as good in some sense, but it's artificial because it's a combination of a whole tone tetrachord and a diatonic tetrachord. When you combine together an asymmetrical collection with a symmetrical collection, then you get a sort of synthetic artificial scale. The octatonic scale is like that, right? Each fully diminished 7th chord is built out of the interval of 3, minor third, which is represented by the integer of 3, right? 3 times 4 equals 12, which is why you have a 4-note fully diminished 7th chord. And then 4 times 3 equals 12, which is why you have 3 different fully diminished 7th chords. So you combine all the fully diminished 7th chords together, you get the chromatic aggregate, all 12 notes. If you only combine 2 of them together, you get an octatonic scale. And that's why we have 3 different octatonic scales, also known as the diminished scale. So yeah, so that's what I would say. Start with an understanding of tonal harmony, read a textbook, write music yourself, listen to music, analyze it, parse the harmonic progressions, and then also build into a sense of voice leading. I think that's where studying Renaissance counterpoint can be particularly helpful, because we, especially nowadays with the advent of pop music and jazz, think that the chord symbols are everything, but the chord symbols are just abstracted representations of what's actually going on harmonically, and the chord symbols don't tell you the function of the harmony, and they also don't tell you what beautiful aesthetic surface structures can arise from particular ways of voice leading the harmonies, right? If I just play this chord and this chord and that chord, it's fine, but if I play the same, what would appear to be the same progression with regards to the mere chord symbols, if I voice lead it in a different way, maybe it gives me a different aesthetic surface structure, right? So there's all that subtlety that happens, and that's where studying counterpoint can be useful, because counterpoint really magnifying glasses in on the linear details of the voice leading, whereas tonal harmony focuses on the vertical sonority and the functionality. And then your job as a composer is to eventually synthesize those, and then you have this big giant library of language, and then you sort of pick out your favorite bits of language and assimilate that into what eventually becomes your personal style. Or if you want to be a pastiche composer that merely is able to emulate other composer styles very effectively, I don't think there's anything wrong with that at all, right? And I, for better or worse, probably for worse, want to try and do both. That's been my biggest issue. There's only so much time in the day. I want to develop my own style, but I also want to be able to write in all of these different styles, and there's, as John Williams has said, there's always a degree to which you can't escape your own fingerprint, right? Or you can't escape your own handwriting, I think is what he said. So yeah, so you asked a pretty general question. Hopefully that gives you some idea of where to start. Okay. About the Symphony Movement 3 that I wrote, what does this music mean to you? Based on the accompanying image, I'm sure you very intentionally chose. I assume it's expressing some form of desolation or isolation. And then another person asking about the Symphony Movement 3, how do you write something like this? Do you have a structure in your head beforehand? Does it evolve while writing? Same with harmonies in the piece itself. Do you just experiment and write down what you like until you feel it's finished? Or do you feel like you need to connect the beginning to the end? If so, how? I often find myself writing, and after a while I'm like, what does that have to do with how the piece originally started? Do you think you have to pick up melodies and themes from the beginning of the piece later on, or is it okay to just evolve without looking back? Well, this is interesting because linearity, direction, formal structure are all like Western ideas. And there are two kinds of ideas that aren't that, which are also interesting. So there's the sort of Stimmung idea of moment time, where you have a bunch of individual moments, and none of them relate to each other at all. There's no relation. There's no consistent thematic material. And Eric Satie also did this in his Ballet Parade, which is a really interesting piece of music. I would highly recommend checking it out. There's no sense of formal direction. It's just a bunch of, it's like a sampler tray of different kinds of music. That can be really interesting. And then there is the sort of Eastern idea of honing in and focusing on one thing, where there's very little variety and just a focus on one modality or one motive. And the minimalism sort of arises out of that. Minimalism takes the focus, but also free form aspect of Eastern music, particularly Hindustani music, and combines it with the sort of North African rhythmic complexities, and with the American, Western European, I should say, idea of structure, and that's really where minimalism comes from. So these are all totally different ways of conceiving music. What I tend to write in my own music, to answer your question, which isn't the only way of writing, but it's my personal favorite way of writing, is I want to make, I think of themes and melodies, and even the combinations of themes and harmonic progressions, materials, so to speak. And there's a great interview with Aaron Copeland. It's like 30 minutes long. It's on YouTube, where he sort of talks about this. You have to have material, some type of idea. And I think of that like a character, right? You can conceive of a character, but then in order to put the character in a book, you do have the goal of wanting to showcase some facet of this character's personality, right? And sometimes a character on the surface level has all kinds of capacity underneath that you wouldn't realize immediately, right? Like, you wouldn't think of the hobbits as being particularly adventurous, right? They just sort of, sit around and eat all day, and, adventures are nasty things. Whereas as Frodo and Bilbo especially proves, there's something more to this race of creatures than we think. And part of the story of The Lord of the Rings is to tell a story where there are plot points, certainly, but it's also to develop the characters. And you can mix characters together and see how they interact with one another, right? And you get different dynamics, right? It's like you get to know, and this if you're hanging out with friends, right? So you let's say Mary, and Mary's like the super quirky, like artsy, and you love hanging out with Mary, and Mary's cool. And then John, right? And John's like super, sort of straight ahead, very methodical and calculated, just to be extreme about it. And you've hung out with him so frequently as individuals, one-on-one, that you feel like you are intimately familiar with every facet of their personality, right? But there's a certain degree to which that is an illusion, because if you then bring all three of you in the room together, there's a whole new dynamic that happens. And they say things that you never would have thought they would have said, and you're like, wait a second, I don't actually know these people, because we don't, right? We only get to know, to some extent, I don't want to say facades, because that sounds cynical, but aspects, right? It's like a prism, right? A prism takes white light. People are like white light, and a prism splits it into lots of different colors, right? And you, in given repeated interaction situations, only may ever get to see one color of the person. So what I try to do is come up with a preconceived set of thematic material. Here are my ideas. And then I try to think, how are they related to one another? And the way that I compose those ideas in the first place are either they just sort of pop into my head, or I have some sense of what emotional framework I want to try and express, right? It can be the idea. It can be a sort of philosophical or emotional idea. I'm trying to think of a specific example, like the idea of meeting someone who you really want to know, but because of some circumstance, you'll never be able to fully get to know them. And so then you come up with a fantasy that you can get to know that isn't the real them, right? But then you figure out that this fantasy actually isn't them. And then you figure out that you actually don't want them because you merely projected your conception of what you thought they would be onto them. And then you figure out, okay, well, what is this conception of what I want out of this person? And then you think about, is that conception actually valid, or is that a result of some other, and that sounds kind of psychoanalytical, but like expressing that would be like something I would try to do in writing an art piece of music, right? And the way in which I would express that would be totally different from any of y'all if you went to write a piece of music. So I don't think programmatically when I write music, but I also don't think absolute, right? I don't just think just the notes and nothing, you know. And I also don't think like, you know, birds and this person is walking over to here and going to, and suddenly the moon comes out, right? I don't think about that because I'm not a really sensor-oriented person. I'm more of an intuitive. I think of psychoanalytical emotional frameworks that manifest themselves in real experience, and that's why I can bring out images if I need to. But the image is just a particular manifestation of the underlying archetype, to risk sounding like Peterson. So I take that material, and then it's like bricks, right? And then I try and write a piece of music, often non-linearly. I'll write this and then this. Like for my first symphony, the big brass climax, dum dum ba da dum da da dum ba da da. That big brass climax, I wrote that first, so that the beginning could lead up to it, right? And one of my conceptions of that, which is musical, but also has psychological undertones, was the idea of taking a single theme and that in and of itself is harmonically ambiguous or chromatic, and playing it by itself. So you're like, what is this that I'm listening to, right? But then it goes away, and then it sort of comes back and hints at and comes back. It's sort of like, it's like a dream that you have, and then you forget the dream. And then during the day, there are moments at which you think you remember the dream, but no, right? You know, and then you keep, and that happens over and over again until suddenly the whole dream comes back, and you're like, whoa. And then there's a degree to which you can't separate the dream from reality, because maybe the dream is a sort of representation of reality. And so that's something that I tried to express in my first movement of my first symphony, right? So yeah, so I could go on, but I don't want to go on for too long. But that's basically what I do. Think of an emotional or psychological framework, come up with thematic material that represents the substantive aspects of that, and then have those materials interact like characters, right? And then the continuity of the piece of music comes from the fact that you're using a limited number of characters, so your audience can become attached to them, right? If you introduce too many characters in a book, you can never become attached to them. And if you only introduce one character or two characters, then it becomes boring and you grow tired of them. So there's a balance that needs to happen there. And then it's just a matter of formal proportions, getting the details of the story right. Should there be an extra bar here? Would this be more effective? Because you have to figure out what you want the goalpost to be. And then, but you have to set up all of the goalposts before you can look back and be like, okay, I got to do that, and then I got to do that. Okay, great. Okay. But you can't manipulate the forest until all of the trees are in place, if that makes sense. But again, that's just one linear way of writing music. That's the way that I do it. There are other emotionally effective ways of writing music, like I talked about before. All right, the next thing, which is the last question that a couple of people asked, and then I want to get to some of your questions. College. People are like, did you enjoy your college education? Do you think it's worth it to go to college? To ask specific questions, one person said, do you believe that college is completely necessary for aspiring film composers? Recently, I felt the need to take a year off and write the music that I want to write, but everyone's telling me I'm an idiot. Another asks, if I complete harmony, counterpoint, and orchestration books of Walter Piston and I read scores, then should I still need to go to university? Is it necessary to go to university, or one can become an exceptional composer like Thomas Newman? I'm asking this because most material on YouTube are being made simple enough to teach the subscribers, are mostly made for epic failure music. Okay, so there is certainly a large degree to which pedagogical, educational material has been made available to everyone, right? So what are you going to get out of college? Well, if you were a historian or any number of other majors like that, where it's merely the delineation of information that you want and the sort of categorization of what is more or less relevant, then I would say you don't need to go to college at all. With music, it's a little bit different because there's an experience aspect to it, right? Like, for example, I've had the opportunity to collaborate with all kinds of other great musicians and write pieces of music for them, and they've shown me all kinds of subtleties about the way that their instrument works, and I've just been ensconced in this environment of musicians, and that has nurtured me as a composer in a way that I wouldn't be able to get if I was simply just researching stuff online. Okay. There's also the subjective artistic element of music. It's not the sort of objective delineation of facts like in medical fields and scientific fields. Because it's so subjective, if you find a really good composition teacher or theory teacher, you can sort of absorb some of their subjective conception of the world, and that can be very useful because that's not something that you're going to get from any other person except them. So I would say that generally speaking, if you want to become a really good composer, you certainly can do that outside of college, right? You know, and there have been all kinds of composers that haven't gone to college, and there's a degree to which I don't regret going to college because I had a great experience. But there have been times where I was like, man, I want to drop out right now so I can just go write music for games because I feel like I'm ready, right? So it's a sort of give and take. And I went to a liberal arts university where I had all kinds of, like religion and the environment and psychology and physics and all kinds of other classes weren't related to music, but then a lot of music-related classes. And I enjoyed that, and I think it enriches one as an individual to sort of interdisciplinarily combine all of these different subjects together and see analogs between music and these other things. I think that's useful, right? But people have different temperaments. Some people just aren't as, I don't want to say aren't as intellectually oriented, but some people find the process of assimilating new information to be more generally interesting than other people. And so if you're not the type of person that's like that, then I would say probably going to college isn't right for you, or at least going to a conservatory might be right for you. And then there's the matter of the advantage between the, yeah, sorry, I do speak fast. That's why you can, hopefully it's clear enough so that later on, if you turn the speed on YouTube down to like 5%, you should be able to hear it. But yeah, sorry. If I try to speak slower, it's fine, but then my brain goes ahead and then I can't process information properly. What was I talking about? College, differentiating the classically oriented education of music conservatory from something like Berkeley or the LA Academy of Scoring Arts. The latter is more utility, pragmatically driven, where they basically just give you a bunch of tools and say, here's a hammer, here's a wrench, here's a bar, here's a bar. You figure out how to use it. And they don't sort of give you a generalized, overarching sense of what it means to become a composer, right? They don't really focus on anything individually. And so if you are someone that needs to be fed a lot of information, then you will take that and assimilate from it some sense of, what you want to do as a composer, then that might work out for you. Whereas if you're a person that likes to focus and hone in on and have an understanding of particular given musical styles, then the sort of more classically oriented education might be better for you. And there's a degree to which there are universities which have them overlapping with one another. But I don't want to cast aspersions on Berkeley. I really don't. But I've had people come to me who have masters in Berkeley, and they have looked at my music or someone else's music or whatever, and I don't mean this self-congratulatory, but they're like, I don't know how to write this. Like, you wrote this, John. Like, I don't know what the Octatonic. I don't know what this is. I don't know what that. They're like, there's so much that they don't know, despite having gone to Berkeley University. And then I asked them about their experience, and they said that they just basically got a bunch of different classes that just sort of like did a bird's eye flyover of a couple things, and then there was so much time spent practicing that they never had the chance to delve into these views. And I think that it's important to have time to delve in. I took a year off before I came to college, and that gave me a lot of time to delve in. And even now, I always make sure that I make time for delving in, right? Because there's part of it is consumption, right? You're given new information. But if you don't ever synthesize and integrate that information into your body of knowledge and experience, then you're never going to be able to use it to write anything. It's just going to be theoretical knowledge that isn't embodied, right? So that is to say that whether or not college is right for you completely depends upon your own individual needs and your temperament. Okay, and it depends upon the college that you're going to. I would say that music more than anything, if you don't go to a particular college because the college generally has prestige, right? Don't go to Juilliard because it's Juilliard. Oh my God, Juilliard may be the right fit for you, but don't go because it's Juilliard. You know what I mean? And don't get this. Don't get an ego inflation kind of temptation to, oh, I want to get a PhD because, then I'll have a PhD, or I want to go to Eastman because, God, if I get into Eastman, then everyone will respect me as a musician. That's not the right reason that that's not the right mindset to have at all. You should think about, what do I want to achieve as a musician? What kind of experience do I want to have? What experience would I be able to have if I'm not outside of college? And that's another thing too. Temperamentally, some people are more self-driven than other people, and there's nothing wrong with that. It's just the way that it is. I, for whatever genetic reason, am a very driven, self-driven person, right? If I have spare time, I'm constantly reading new composition books, listening to new pieces of music. Like, I get so bored with just not doing anything, right? I have to constantly be consuming new stuff. And so I almost get more frustrated by my professors forcing me to focus on this given thing. It's like, I understand it. Can we move on to the next subject? They're like, no, you got to do this to get the good grade. I'm like, okay, fine. But there's a degree to which I feel like that, to some extent, sometimes is a waste of my time. But there are other people who aren't as self-driven and who are more consumatory, right? Sort of extroverted perceiving. And they need to be fed information. And there's nothing wrong with that. And if you're that type of person, then you would really benefit from college, because you need people to sort of give you some structure, externally imposed structure, right? Some people just can't impose internal structure. And that's just a personality temperament thing. But then the last point that I want to make is that if you want to go study composition at university, you have to pick it because of the composition professor, right? Because composition is so subjective that you simply are just not going to have a good time working with a composition instructor if you don't respect them and if you don't like their music, right? You have to find a composer and you love their music and you really respect them, and then you're going to have a great time, because a lot of what you're going to get out of composition is having private instruction with a given composer. And that is just not something that's systematized. Every composer is different, right? So if you do decide to go to a university for composition, make sure you meet with the composition professor and listen to their music and explore their corpus of works and see whether or not it's aligned with your own aesthetic tastes. That being said, again, I think there have been all kinds of people that have done very well outside of college, and you can find the information is outside of college, right? I would say that the only thing that is really difficult to get outside of college is experience writing for live players, because it requires money, right? If you're not in a college environment on campus with a bunch of other really good musicians, in order to get musicians to collaborate with you, you're going to have to pay them, obviously, to perform your music. And if you write, it's a catch-22, because your music isn't to some extent going to be well orchestrated until you have experience writing for people. But people won't let you write for them until you're a good orchestrator, right? So that's one of the useful things about college, is that it gives you this student environment where we're all students, we're all learning here, right? No one pays each other, and we're just collaborating. And so you can really sort of be a good woodwind writer and understand how trombone slide positions works, and the harps and the diatonic pedals, and the fact that you can't play snap pits at a high enough range, and the fact that within a tetrachord you can play quick passages in thumb position on cello, which gives the cello a longer range relative to its lower string, but not the double bass because it's tuned in fourth. Like, all of that information is just stuff that you're not going to get in an instrumentation manual, right? But that being said, there have been some great educators recently that have offered personalized experiential information like that. Like Thomas Goss's 100 Orchestration Tips is a great book that has all kinds of personal tips. And so there may be a point in which more of this information becomes delineated. But again, to some extent, experience, you can't make up for experience. But if you can find an internship working for some place where you're watching all of this happen and you get the opportunity to write cues. I mean, that's what John Williams did. John Williams first played piano for like Peter Gunn and a bunch of different shows and stuff like that in the pit orchestra. He was a trained pianist from Juilliard and a jazz pianist and a classically trained pianist. And he played in the orchestra, and then gradually people gave him an opportunity. People were like, hey, you went to Juilliard. Can you orchestrate this cue? We need someone to orchestrate this cue. And he's like, okay. So he did it. He did a great job. And they're like, okay, great. You did a great job. Orchestrate these two cues. And he did it. And then gradually it got to the point where people started noticing his orchestrations, like, hey, can you write some music? Can you ghostwrite, 32 bars of music for this cue, because our composer doesn't have enough time. So then he ghost wrote it, and then people were like, oh, you write good music. And then gradually that built up until he started writing original features for television shows, and then he started writing feature films, and then Spielberg came to him, and then that relationship flowered into the career that he has today, right? So obviously he did have a college education, but that's something that if you find a particularly good job or internship, you can get that sort of experience. Or if you have money, you can just pay players to performing music. But there are all kinds of cool, like the harp. I can't remember her name, but there's a woman, phenomenal harpist on Facebook. I'm sure 15-second harp is what she calls her page, where she has people submit 15-second harp excerpts, and then she performs them, and then in detail delineates exactly what's playable and not playable about them. That's wonderful. If that can exist with every, then that sort of maybe will give you outside of college the type of thing that I'm talking about. And if you're only ever planning on writing for samples, well, then all the experience you need you can get on your own, right? Colleges are so dinosaur, bureaucratic, slow, unchanging, and systematized hierarchies that sample libraries and the technology of good sampling and mixing and mastering is always increasing, such that if you ever go to university for like mixing and mastering and sampling, they're always going to be behind. You know what I mean? There's no getting around that, right? Whereas instruments haven't really changed for any period of time. What is a good orchestration today acoustically is not really any different than back in Rimsky-Korsakov's day. It was in Beethoven's day before the instruments were finalized, but so there's a bit of a difference there. So hopefully that kind of covers some pros and cons. Okay. Let's see, what do we got next? My voice is going to die earlier than thought. Are video games art? Yeah, art is aesthetic production. It's just producing something that has aesthetic value, right? And aesthetics create emotional and psychological responses, right? So it's the right brain side of everything, right? So video games have artistic components, certainly. There's art, which is literally just art, like art, like painting, right? Especially abstract painting, right? It's not representing anything. It's literally just aesthetic, right? And it produces some sort of response in you. That is the artiest art that there can be, right? If it can be put that way. Then there's food. Food has artistic components. It's not like, is food an art or is food not an art? Well, there are types of cooking that focus more on the artistic aspects of the culinary endeavor than other types of, like if I'm designing a meal to be as functional as possible and give you all the nutrients that you need, then there's no art in that, right? It's just like a freeze-dried thing, But if there's food that is so focused on aesthetics that it isn't maybe fulfilling enough to fill you up, and it maybe, although good cooks would argue that you can achieve the art and the taste, and that the taste is a part of the art, but that which is aesthetic about something, I would say generally is artistic, right? And that which is pragmatic or functional is not artistic. So I don't think it's a matter of, is anything, are books art? Is dance art? Is Sudoku puzzles art? It's like, I think it's just a matter of, if it has the degree to which it expresses aesthetics is the degree to which it is artistic. That may seem like an oversimplification, but that's my views on the thing. So I think some video games are more artistic than other video games, and it doesn't mean that it makes some video games better than other video games. So video games are just such a multimedia, all-encompassing, much like film, but except they're interactive. So I think even more so than film, genre of game playing, that there's a lot to video games. There's a lot of aesthetics, there's a lot of art, there's a lot of left brain computation, there's a lot of puzzle solving, there's a lot of storytelling, so right, no, that's exactly right. Same with a board game, card game, right, exactly. So like if you play like Magic the Gathering, the game as a purely intellectual construction would work with the same exact mechanics and be arguably just as left brain fun if you took out all the art and you just saw the numbers and the RPG mechanics, right? But when you add the aesthetic, it adds an extra level of immersion where the sort of concrete RPG mechanics are fun for the left brain, but the right brain lets you sort of get immersed in this world and culture. And so I think good games do have that left brain and right brain. The non-college route, though, does point towards a further prevalence of Zimmer. Okay. Yeah, but if you're talking about the implications of the average composer not going to college, creating a proclivity for not understanding the fundamentals of music theory and being able to write well for acoustic instruments, as a sociological phenomenon, that's totally different, right? I totally agree with you, but I'm not going to tell an individual whether or not I think they should go to college based upon what the larger trend result is of most people going not to college, right? So yeah, that's a whole other conversation that we can get into at some point, but I don't want to. That's a huge conversation. I don't want to derail that now. The whole, is music theory necessary? Is learning music notation necessary? Is it necessary to have a fundamental understanding intellectually of? And there are lots of intuitive geniuses who do have an understanding of music. It's just embodied, right? And so it's not articulated. So they wouldn't be able to teach it very well, and they maybe wouldn't be able to expand because they're so right brain oriented. And then there are people who are left brain oriented who understand all the stuff, but they can't actually write music. I think personally, good composers should have a strong intuition and shouldn't be burdened by the sort of artificial drawing lines of music theory, which is ultimately just an abstract representation. It's like complexity theory, right? Any abstract representation you have of a thing of necessity eliminates certain detail that's irrelevant to the achieving of a particular goal, right? It goes back to the whole like using numerals, right, to represent reality. Like math is incredibly powerful, and it is accurate insofar as you're only considering that which can be abstracted into the numbers. If I look at, this candle, right, as opposed to that candle over there, they are two candles, right? 1 + 1 = 2, right? But one and one does not tell you what's different about them, right? One of them is green, one of them is blue. They both may be the same diameter. One's taller than the other one. One's burning. There's all kinds of detail that's left out. So insofar as I'm only concerned about the quantity of the entities and I'm organizing the candles in that way, then I only need to use the numerals as abstract representations of that which matters to me, right? So I could say 2 candles and 1 water bottle, or I could say 3 objects, right? So that is just to say that one shouldn't conflate the abstract representation, which is what the notes are in music theory and concepts like that are, with the actual manifestation of the thing, right? This can be very pragmatically useful, but if you get so focused on that, it can become rigid, and then you can't push yourself forward artistically. But the general point that I wanted to make is that there are people who didn't actually learn anything consciously. But that doesn't mean that the knowledge isn't there. It's just in their brain and it's embodied. There are phenomenal players who are incredibly intuitive, right? And then there are phenomenal players who are incredibly cerebral, and there are phenomenal players who are a mixture of both. So again, it just goes back to temperament. Okay, I think that's it. Yeah, that's it for the questions asked. Okay, let me scroll all the way up and answer some of y'all's questions. How long will this be until my voice dies? Oh, thanks for all the birthday wishes. I'll probably release a Symphony 1 analysis when I finish the 4th movement, which is this semester. I will be finishing the 4th movement, which is going to be very not obtuse. We'll put it that way. John Williams score that is most unlike John Williams? Yeah, Memoirs of a Geisha is, I agree, it's an incredibly underrated score and very uncharacteristic of his usual style. I love that score. Any tips on writing for flute quartet? What's the instrumentation specifically? Tell me. Is it 2 flutes piccolo and bass flute? Is it 2 flutes alto flute and bass flute? Is it 4 flutes? Tell me specifically what the instrumentation is. Right, exactly. That's exactly right. We perceived a 4th as consonants and a 3rd as dissonant in the pre-Renaissance era, because that's why they called the imperfect consonances imperfect, right? 4ths and 5ths were considered to be pure and perfect. So yeah, it's not that it's entirely subjective, but there are various interpretations of the objective. So you take the seating into consideration when composing music. Sometimes, I mean, you can't. I'm reticent to compose a piece of music that relies so heavily on stereophonic and three-dimensional aural effects such that some of the artistic conception and aesthetic value would be lost if it were performed by a group that didn't have that particular seating, right? So I like to have strings, first on the left and seconds on the right. The reason that the first and seconds are together is historically because of the fact that they play common lines together. They often play, they'll play in octaves, they'll play parallel thirds and parallel sixths. So it makes sense for them to be together because they hear each other, right? And it's the same thing with the cellos and basses, right? The cellos and basses for a long, extended period of time just doubled each other all the time, right? So it makes sense for them to sit next to each other. And it doesn't create a stereophonic unbalance or disparity because, you know, listening on headphones and speakers like everyone does today is totally different from an acoustic environment, right? If you're listening to like a symphony in a great concert hall, only really the conductor gets stereophonic view. Even if you're in the first row, the sound is already homogenized and blended amongst the room so that when it comes to you, you can still hear some sense of where things are located, but it isn't nearly as artificially partitioned as it is with headphones, especially. So given that most people listen to headphones nowadays, I will often create unconventional panning setups that are tailor-made for particular sections, which are designed to get certain effects. And panning, so let me re-articulate. If I'm writing a piece of music that is intended to be sampled or where the recording is the ultimate priority because the recording is going to be used in a film or game and that's what's going to be heard, then I might enlist seating and stereophonic panning and those types of gimmicks, for lack of a better word, because I'm not concerned that it's going to, because if I did that, okay, and I don't do that for purely acoustic concert music, because I want my concert music in some sense to be as versatile as possible. I want it to be a good piece of music regardless of who plays it and where they're seated, to the degree that that's pragmatic and possible. Yeah, the primary reason why doubling real orchestral instruments with VST sampled instruments nowadays, and this is sort of the cutting edge of sampling, has to do with the articulation, right? So the complexity of the overtones and the waveform fidelity, to put it that way, artificially MIDI generated synthesized wavetable synthesis or any kind of synthesis generating sounds cannot be as, I don't want to say complex because it technically can be as complex, but it can't be as subtle as actual violin playing the sound, right? Because the horsehair hitting the bow and there's a mixture of noise and the sound of the wood resonating, and you get all this little detail that you just are not going to get if it's like no performer where it's a synthesized sound, right? But there is a fundamental issue with the conception of how sampling works and how it relates to different instruments having different attack points. So in real life, when a string player sees a note, the beat is going in their head. They're looking at the conductor, right? But when you hit a string instrument, it's not boom, right? It's not like it isn't as if the peak of the audio is at the very beginning and then it only gets quieter from there, the way that a glockenspiel would be almost that way. To some extent, every instrument, unless it's an artificial synthesizer, has some of that, right? But some instruments have that the first. There's a specific name for that, the immediate attack. We'll just call it the attack. The triangulation of the attack, it changes depending upon what the instrument is. So like a piano and glockenspiel snare drum has a very fast attack, whereas like a string instrument or a French horn has a much slower attack, right? In any case, the point that I'm making is that a string player would start moving their bow before the specific beat metric moment in time at which they need to play that note, right? Because they would want the yum, not the yum, but the yum, the part that is at its loudest. They would want that to be located metrically at a point in time that needs to be located, and so they'd have to start playing a little bit ahead of time. That's impossible to do when you're playing a note on the keyboard, right? If there was some sort of camera or you had some sort of like device on your finger, maybe it may be able to do that, which would be really interesting if that were the case. Or some neural node connected to your brain, knowing the intention of what you're going to do before you did it. But the computer is just playing an audio file. And so when you hit the button on the keyboard, the computer is not getting any input from you, obviously, until the very moment at which you hit that button, in which case it's too late. So that's why legato strings often have this laggy quality to them, right? Because in order to have a legato string, you have to have an attack that's, and there's also, once you've already attacked and then you're playing a series of notes with true legato, there's another issue having to do with the fact that you're crossfading from a given pitch, looping back in on itself, and then and so when the crossfades happen, you're cutting off the reverb that would be played by the original room, which is why generally, as much as I love Cinesamples, any sample library that has a built-in room sound is not ever going to sound as smooth than if you started with completely dry samples and then added the reverberation after the fact, so you don't get that effect. But that's derailing the conversation. To answer your specific question, the reason why people have found synthesized instruments in combination, they'll use, for example, the sound of like 8 artificial violins and 7 acoustic violins and 1 solo violin. The reason why that is the case, well, it's twofold. One, when you layer different instruments on top of one another, you can perform different performances, slightly humanistically different performances of the same thing, and that gives it a sense of realism, right? Because in real life, in the context of playing, the players are not going to be perfect. There's going to be some slight humanization. Whereas even though humans are playing a given sample, I mean, you all know how they go sample. Like if you watch a sampling session, they're like 1, 2, 3. Bum, right? In a vacuum sealed laboratory environment, they can be perfectly on in a way that they just are not going to be in real life in the middle of playing some line, right? So you can compensate for that by layering together different instruments, but that isn't really directly related to what you're talking about. The reason why synthesized instruments are great is because they have excellent attack, right? They have a super strong, clear, clean attack that can sort of fix itself after the fact. Whereas the sustain of the real live player has a richness to it that the synthesized sound can't beat. So you sort of have the best of both worlds with regard to attack and sustain. And that's, among other reasons, that's why a lot of people are combining synthesized sounds with real orchestral sounds. It's not that it to some extent is making up for a natural issue that arises with the very nature of the process of how sampling works in the first place. Obviously, that doesn't account for utilizing non-orchestral sounds and just combining synths with the orchestra in general, but that's a different. I'm assuming that's not what you were talking about, because that's a different conversation. To what extent do you think composition requires academic knowledge versus creativity? Yeah, I think I said that earlier. It just depends upon your experience and your genetic endowment. Some people are. I feel like I try to make up for the left brain what I don't naturally have with the right brain. I think I have decent intuitions, but I know all kinds of musicians who have just like amazing musical intuition and sensitivity, and I can't comprehend how that, because I'm just not like that, right? But I certainly have a greater level of musical intuition than some people, right? So everyone sits on a spectrum. So I think it's just a matter of being honest with yourself, right? To what degree are you musically sensitive, right? And it's actually interesting, not to get into that whole conversation, but the whole emotional sensitivity thing is so important. It's so important to be emotionally sensitive when you're writing a piece of music, because you see things that you wouldn't normally see, just like it's important to have good color vision to be able to be an artist. I found that when I get a lot of sleep, when I get like at least 9 hours of sleep and I'm well rested, and I drink a lot of water and get really good nutrition, I am more emotionally sensitive. And I don't mean that in the volatile way, but I mean that I have a greater proclivity to be deeply affected by music. And I'll listen to music that I've heard before, and it'll bring me to tears in a way that it simply wouldn't. It sounds weird if I only had 7 hours of sleep and just had like a cheeseburger earlier, So I've discovered with me personally over the years that there's a great degree to which with regard to physical health, and cardio is another thing that's helped me out a lot, and meditation, you need to realize that musical ability is a singular manifestation of all kinds of other processes that are happening. Right. And so there are things that you need to work on which are primarily musical, but there's also non-musical things which manifest themselves in your music that you need to work on, that can make your music better as well. So I would say, yeah, if you feel like you are listening to music and you can't figure out what's going on, and your intuition is not sufficient to replicate it using your ear, then you need academic knowledge. And there's nothing wrong with that, but it just means that, it's the same thing is true in reverse. If you're the type of person who is extremely, well, I don't even need to say it. It's the same. It goes both ways. You just basically just need to make up for what your deficiencies are and capitalize on your strengths. Do you like Brazil? Yes, I like Brazil. I love Brazilian music and Brazilian rhythms. What do you think about Dorico? I haven't used Dorico once. This is kind of funny. I shouldn't say this because I don't want to slander the company, because I love Dorico, and I think Dorico is going to turn out to be, I'm probably going to switch over to it once it has all the features that Sibelius has. But I was going to buy Dorico under the academic discount, and I sent them the Furman proof of that I was enrolled academically in Furman, and they, for some reason, didn't accept that. They were like, this is an invalid academic. And so I was going to contact them, but then I just sort of fell by the wayside. And I'm so fast with Sibelius, or comfortable, I should say, with, because there are people that are faster than me. I'm comfortable with Sibelius to the extent that it's going to take some conscious effort and carved out time for me to switch to a new system, but I'm confident that Dorico, if it keeps progressing like it's going to, is going to be the replacement for Sibelius ultimately, especially considering the state of the development scheme. Is it possible and effective to use pitch class set to write a specific type of music? Is it usable the same way that harmonic relativity, where it could lead you places you wouldn't think of? Oh yeah, absolutely. And pitch class set is just a abstracted system. It's just a way of categorizing intervals, right? And so the fact that we even use the diatonic scale and the whole tone scale, or that we use the 037 major and minor triads as subsets of one another, we're using set theory in some sense. It's like saying, did numbers exist before math exists? It's like, well, yeah, the numbers just in abstraction explain the phenomenon of interactions of entities and reality, right? So I don't think of pitch class set theory as necessarily something that's qualitatively new. I just think of it as just a clear, mathematical, concise representation of intervals. I do think that set theory leaves out the overtone series, which is important. Set theory will often make you think that things are equivalent in the mathematical system that actually aren't equivalent in real life when you hear them, because set theory only takes into account the fundamental pitches and not the overtone series. And set theory is based on a mod 12 arithmetic system, or a base 12 arithmetic system, which assumes that the equidistance of the semitones in our 12-tone pitch collection, which is resultant from the equally tempered overtone system, it assumes that that is substantive, and to some extent that is, it's not arbitrary, but it is a pragmatic approximation of trying to create a system in which we have as many sonorities that are as close to being in tune with the overtone series as possible. But there's more to the picture than just that. So I would be hesitant in thinking set theory as sort of the explain all method. It's like one of those mathematical methods that worked well for an extended period of time, but then were eventually replaced, just like the Newtonian physics was eventually replaced by quantum mechanics. It pragmatically can produce particular results, given that you aren't concerned with that which it does not explain, right? You think there's such a thing as universally great music? I think there is great music in the sense that there is universally great music in the sense that it has the capacity, in the sense that every individual, provided that they have working ears, right, and are healthy psychologically, they have the capacity to listen to it and experience almost religious, not metaphysically religious, but religious kind of transcendental, deep emotional quality, right? So you can certainly find music which everyone loves, but then someone else comes along and listens to it and they're like, yeah, well, this doesn't really affect me. And it's like, is that the music's fault or is that your fault, right? And again, I don't want to conflate, because I do think that can be taken too far, where you can write anything, and the idea is that as long as I can somehow reinterpret what I'm looking at or listening to in such a way that it moves me, then that means that the thing itself is of value. But no, it just means that you're really good at BSing yourself, if that makes sense, right? So it's a really difficult thing to disentangle. What if a piece of music doesn't seem to have power, or does seem to have emotionally expressive power in a given number of people, of human beings? It's difficult to figure out whether or not that is because of what is human and what is of the music, right? And you could argue that, well, it's always ultimately human, because sound waves are just vibration of air particles and, just representations of information, but the information has to be interpreted by some entity that can interpret the information, right? If we were to just put a book up into space, an English book, and aliens were to come along and see it, if they didn't have linguistic capacity, or if they had never had reference, to the way that our linear language works, they may never be able to figure out what the symbols even mean, right? But we know what it means because we all have an existing lexicon of words and syntax and semantics and phonology that we can use to interpret that. But music is a bit different, because the proclivity for music, I guess you could say the proclivity for language is burned. That's what Noam Chomsky said, that we all have innate grammatical competence. But I think we all have, the difference is that the innate grammatical competence that we have is just really has to do with verbal abstraction, but the nature of the manifestation of the abstraction is arbitrary, right? Which is why you have a bunch of different languages that are all totally different on the surface level, different syntax, different phonology, different sounds that are made, but ultimately you can create synonymous sentences in each one of those languages that roughly communicate the same thing. But the capacity to build an artificial language, which is just a manifestation of the thoughts you're trying to communicate in an abstracted form, such that you can communicate it to someone else, that natural proclivity is universal in everyone. But I think music is even more universal than that, because not only do we have the proclivity to have a sensitivity towards music, but the sensitivity towards music that we have is not learned, right? Language has to be painstakingly learned. You have to associate dog with the thing that's dog. You recognize the thing that's dog, and you don't need the word to know that it exists, although the word can sort of clarify your thinking, but sometimes to a negative extent, right? And I think, well, that's a whole other conversation. But whereas with music, babies can listen to music and have emotional reactions before they're even capable of speaking language. So I think there's something more fundamental about the way that music, for whatever reason, interacts with our minds. And of course, music is one of the most ineffable things. Like, we have no idea what music is, right? We can postulate that it arose for these adaptive reasons, but there's so much subtlety to it. It's such an integral part of the human experience, but compared to how little we know about it. On the subject of, whoa, I lost my place. I am working on a piece. I'm happy with the A and B sections, but not sure what to do for the next section. How would you approach this problem? Well, first you need to articulate exactly what you're trying to accomplish with the piece of music, right? Like, how is the A section aesthetically? How is the B section aesthetically? Are they more contrasting to one another, or are they more comparative, right? Do you want the C section to be a combination and development of them? You could do that. You could combine A and B. You could take the thematic material and break them into smaller Lego pieces and then build a new Lego set by combining two previous Lego sets together for the C section. Or you could just go back to A, right? So it's sort of like an argument between A and B. A, no B, no A, and A sort of polishes his or her thought process, and then B sort of polishes so they keep re-articulating the same thing, like two people arguing with each other at about a point, right? So because you can have a debate, an argument where themes argue, or you can have a conversation that just sort of gets led stream of consciousness, right? But it should make sense. People often say, I want the music to be able to be led organically from one thing to the next, and that can be effective as long as the causal relationship of one thing to the next thing is nodally connected, even if tangentially, right? And eventually you'll find, if you're having a good conversation, it's not that you're constantly being led to new and 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 new things to where you end up where you're totally different from where you started. But it's also not that you overly focus on a given thing sort of pathologically, right? But it is that you have a central node of a very vague kind of topic, right? And then you work outward. You go up here, and then you start, and then this leads to that, and this leads to that, and then you're like, okay, interesting. And then you sort of start back in the middle, and then you go out this way, right? So you reach all kinds of different spots, but it's all connected to the center of a spider web, right? And I think Stravinsky's Rite of Spring is like that. On the surface level, it's like new material, new material, new material, new material, but everything is related to one another, and it all has a general aesthetic, which is sort of the amorphous kind of center of the spider web that connects everything together, even though on the surface level, on a note-by-note basis, you can't say that, within a given section, there's a lot of continuity, but from one section to the next section, there's a lot of new stuff, but you can abstract beyond that and say, okay, well, yeah, but there's a lot of asymmetry, there's a lot of polytonality, there's a lot of representations of nature, right? And then there's the overall coherency of the narrative of this girl being sacrificed, in this Russian paganism of this girl being sacrificed to try and have a better spring. That connects everything together. So it just depends upon what approach you want to take. And if you literally just can't decide, it doesn't even matter. Just pick one. It can be arbitrary. Just pick a goal for yourself. Hey, I want to try to approach it this way. And at the very least, if you try and do that and you find out that you don't like it, well, that's one way to not make a light bulb, right? And you'll eventually. But you can't to some extent you can't just sort of sit here in a vacuum and I know what I want, right? To some extent you have to do it, right? Unless you have a very, very good internal ear and can try out all of these things in your head. If you can't do that, and most people can't do that, then you just have to try it out on paper. And once you try it out on paper, and this is where your ear training comes in useful. I shouldn't say that not everyone can do that, because I think people can do that better than they think often that they can if they work on those skills. And that's the biggest, this is another sort of side from the point, but that's where ear training can become extremely helpful, because it allows you to very quickly try out ideas in your head rather than having to write a whole section of music only to realize that you don't like it and erase it and then become demoralized because of that. Your speaking style is similar to Ben Shapiro. Yeah, I've been told that. I love Ben Shapiro. I do give private lessons. If anyone is interested in private lessons, send me an email to jjayberthume@gmail.com. The way that I approach private lessons, and it's crazy because I feel like I just started it yesterday, but I've had I just the other day hit my 200th student. So I've taught over 200 students, which is crazy. But generally speaking, private lessons are very personalized and catered to whatever you want to work. I've had people come to me and be like, I want to learn just, Baroque counterpoint. I'm like, cool, right? But other people are like, tell me more about harmonic relativity. You just have a couple videos and I want to expand it more, but there's so many questions that I have. I was like, cool, right? Other people come to me like, teach me set theory. Other people like orchestration. Other people like, I want to work on my brass, right? So it can be any topic that's related to music and I'll let you know whether or not there's a topic that I don't feel like I'm qualified in. I'll be upfront with you about that. But and then there are people that come to me and they're just like, I just want to learn to be a better composer. And in that case, I'll listen to sort of music that you wrote, and then we'll initiate a dialogue, and I'll try to figure out, what do you want out of music? What kind of composer do you want to be? What music do you like to listen to? And I'll sort of absorb that and kind of develop a kind of fluid curriculum, so to speak, for you to work on. And then that'll be constantly be changing depending upon whether or not you are happy with how the lessons are going. And it's everyone's different. There are some people where it's very dialogue oriented, some people where they like to speak and then they articulate themselves well, and then I sort of tell them a little thing or show them something to answer their question. There are some people that are really introverted and literally just want me to lecture at them for an hour, which is also fine, although I prefer the dialogue. So that's my approach to that. If you want more information about like pricing and time zones and stuff, just send me an email. Have you checked out Kapustin's music yet? No, I've heard of it, but I haven't checked it out. Have you tried scoring in that Vangelis style of improvising along to the film? I have. Yeah, I think it can be very useful. Although my ear is sufficient that I do that when I watch a film. When I'm scoring a film and I look at the film, I just look at it and I sort of try out different things in my head. And to me, that encompasses timbre and texture and the orchestra in a way that just playing on the piano doesn't, right? Because if you write, you can sort of presuppose what will work if you have a really sort of bird's eye view towards the future if you're playing piano against a film. But to me, I have a visceral kind of immediate all-encompassing sense of whether or not something will work or not. That's something that my right brain does well, but my left brain doesn't do well. And so if I play a piece of piano music against a film and I feel intuitively like it doesn't work, it's difficult for me to know whether or not it's because it's a piano or because it's the notes, right? So I feel like if I can try things out in my ear or on, with actually try and write something out and test it against the film, I feel like that's more reliable than me just improvising on the piano. I just finished writing my first symphony. How do I keep from becoming formulaic and never progressing as an artist? I wouldn't necessarily worry too much about becoming formulaic. In some sense, what matters is whether or not you are sufficiently exploring a given location, right? So, like for example, Juhani Radhavara, right? Let's see if I spelled that right. Johanni Radhavara is a composer where pretty much every piece he writes, it's not that it's the same piece. In some sense, it's formulaic, right? But formulaic is the wrong word because the formula is, again, just an abstraction, and provided that you can fit things into the formula, then the formula spits out something that you can then convert back into reality. It's always going to give you the same result. So it's not like it's that a formula, but if you listen to every piece of music that he's written, and you feel like he's always grasping for something, right? And there are great composers that are like that. Like I feel like a lot of what Mozart wrote is formulaic. Honestly, I feel like a lot of what Radhavara wrote is formulaic. I feel like a lot of what John Williams wrote is formulaic, but not in the literal sense of formulaic, but rather in the sense that there is a focus on a kind of, or at least a selection of aesthetics that they really like, that they're really exploring. And there's nothing wrong with that. Again, there are composers that focus on that. So I would ask yourself, if I were you, I would ask myself, am I the type of temperamental person that really wants to focus? In which case, just do that unabashedly and don't worry about whether or not people think you're formulaic, because you'll eventually perfect it and create a masterpiece. Or if you want to be the type of person that is constantly exploring new things, like Stravinsky with his 3 different periods of music, then that's certainly perfectly fine as well. If the latter is the case, then you know what to do. Just read tons of scores, listen to tons of music, listen to new music, right? Get like a classical music book that go through the history of classical music and just start from composer 1 and go through and listen to everything, right? Anytime you chance upon something that you really like, that's fresh, anytime you chance upon something that you really like and you say, I would not have been able to write this, then figure out what's going on, right? And then integrate it into your own music, right? And then if you have an issue doing that, well, then that's a matter of assimilation synthesis, and that's a whole other issue, right? So it's all about diagnosing the problem. Is the problem at this level, or at this level, or at this level, or at this level, or at this level? And then once you diagnose the problem, then you can narrow down your options and then sort of put a plan into action to fix it, right? Because if it's just sort of this amorphous, I don't want to become formulaic, right? Then it's sort of like, well, that might even be misguided depending upon which layer of abstraction you're thinking of. Yeah, I was thinking about that. The neural network performer, that could be really interesting to see how that, I think a neural network that could examine a bunch of different players playing like a note on the G string and then abstracting from that the commonalities and then being able to generate a realistic sound, I think it'd be really interesting. I'll be right back. I returned. Okay. So you use different waveforms with ESX24 in your chiptunes video. How do you change when you're using? Well, the ESX24 is just a sampler. So if that's a specific question about Logic, whenever you download a sound font, if you click on the little button, the little display in the ESX module where it shows the thing, and you click on it, underneath that it should show the Pixelmator sound font, and then you should see all the different options. Or you can just click plus or minus to go back and forth. I don't know if that's what you're asking or not, because if that's not what you're asking, I'm not sure what you're asking. Harpist, yeah, Olivia. Jaguar. I don't know how to pronounce that, but yeah, that's what I was talking about. What makes Dorico something you're looking forward to? The way it looks aesthetically. Well, first off, there are aspects of the software program, the way in which note input works, the way in which magnetic layout works, the way in which it handles tuplets. There are all kinds of issues with Sibelius that Dorico fixes. And I just love the way the mathematical proportions that Dorico is based on, and the fact that it can produce an aesthetically not necessarily impeccable, but very pleasing and readable output with hands-off automaticity that Sibelius doesn't. Although, again, I love Sibelius. I've got very little qualms with Sibelius. It's the touching the realm of beyond human. Well, yeah, it's touching that of human experience, which is connecting us to the rest of nature, because there's that which is human and only human, there's that which is only a compartment of human, but there's that of the human experience that is common to animals and plants and the rest of the universe, just like our brains are in some sense a microcosm of the macrocosm of the universe, right? So yeah. Why does Stravinsky use so many changes in music meters, time signatures, pieces? I need to catch myself. Why did Stravinsky use so many changes of music meters or time signature in his pieces? Is it that he found something that could help develop a piece better, or in a unique way? I think he just liked asymmetry in the same way that Jacob Collier says he likes asymmetry or complexity, right? That there's something about, like Jacob Collier says, the rolling of an egg, the way that it sort of rolls. There's also a degree to which the use of asymmetry in combination with symmetry, because he repeats things all the time, which is like repetition in nature, and there's symmetry that exists in nature, but there's also asymmetry in nature. If you look at one leaf, there's a lot of symmetry. Things go out this way and they go out that way, and then but every tree looks slightly different, right? And if you look at like the land terraces, right? There's fractal patterns to them, and clouds. There's a lot of units, a mixture of yin and yang, order and chaos, uniformity and formity, if that's a word, in nature. And so I think the reason why Stravinsky sort of leaned towards the use of asymmetrical rhythms is because it was more representative of the objective naturalistic world. He thought, and I don't want to say it because I don't know what he thought, but I presume that the classical Western sort of like 4 beats to the bar kind of architectural, perfectly symmetrical, top-down kind of music, not that there's anything wrong with that, couldn't really evoke this sort of pagan, naturalistic, rough, brutal processes, and also beautiful. And that's what I love about The Rite of Spring. It's terrifyingly beautiful, because it's you listen to it and it's like, oh my gosh, it's like looking at a tsunami or looking at trees blowing in the wind. It's terrifying, but it's also beautiful, transcendently beautiful. So I assume that because he really went to town in The Rite of Spring, and The Rite of Spring was sort of Russian primitivism, right? And so the asymmetry helps express the sort of primitivism, less top down, more down up, and then that just became something that integrated itself into his personal style, right? And part of that is just he just liked the sound of asymmetrical rhythms more than symmetrical rhythms. Thanks for subscribing, Corey. Henrik0594 asks, are there any books you would recommend on orchestration? Well, since you've stated aptly that most orchestration books, as you say, are instrumentation books. Although the best one is the new edition of the Adler has a lot of online examples that it comes with, where they recorded the Eastman Symphony Orchestra playing all kinds of examples. Very, very, very useful. And the Principles of Orchestration book by Rimsky-Korsakov, provided that you are intimately familiar with all of his corpus of works so that you can hear them and looking at the score, those are useful and go beyond instrumentation. Besides that, the best book that I know, besides just score reading, obviously, is again Thomas Goss's 100 Orchestration Tips. Right, that book has a ton of useful tips and tricks that talk about how instruments combine with one another and in a way that goes beyond just mere technical baseline understanding of instrumentation. Mike Verda's VI technique addresses the issue of attack. I actually haven't heard of that. If you have a chance, send me an email about that. I'd be interested to know. I'm not really in the sampling business. I have someone sample my stuff now, but that's interesting. Your James Horner score for Sneakers? No, I haven't. There seems to be a huge problem with composers, especially if they have not experienced having your own music being played by a real musician, and that the problem is the fear of emptiness. There is a problem. There can be a problem without having the experience of having the music played by live musicians, but I don't know what you mean by the fear of emptiness. Could you elaborate on that, Rayo Meister Game Channel? I think I might know possibilities of what you mean, but you have to clarify. How do you go about hitting cuts sharply in your DAW? I just do all the math ahead of time with the piano track. Is simply what I do. I figure out, I'll do the click track first, right? So I'll create a tempo. I'll figure out what the primary sync points are, right? And then I'll figure out, okay, what tempo can I choose that aesthetically matches the cue that I want to create musically, and hits as close to many of the sync points as possible. Because there are some hard cuts that need to be hit, right? And there are some that can be a little bit softer, and you can fix those in the orchestration. So I'll just make the click track before I even think about a note. I'll just make the click track, right? And then put those time signature changes and stuff. And then you can still have time signature changes without changing that. Like if I have a 3/4 bar here, and then like 4/4/4/4/4/4/4, and then it works out. If I add a 3/4 bar here, well, if I add a 5/4 bar over here, then we're back to where we started from. So you still have some metric flexibility within the predefined rubric of the scheme, the mathematical scheme for hitting the sync points. But I like to do that ahead of time. To me, there's nothing worse than like having to figure out how to sync something in the middle of writing a piece of music, because then it just ends up sounding contrived musically. Do you use contact and Sibelius or no performer? I've never used contact and Sibelius. I use it with the DAW, but no performer is what I use with Sibelius. All right, we'll go for another 8 minutes or so, and then I gotta head out because my voice is dying. What I mean is composed, orchestrate with a lot of instruments, and don't use solo instruments because it sounds weak in the mix. Oh, okay. This is a good question. When arranging, do you work in smaller sections of 2 to 4 bars or go part by part over something like 8 bars? Okay, this is a great question. This is something that I learned to ameliorate in my later compositional process as I've refined my process over the years. I used to be someone that just focused on note by note, detail. But the problem with that is you get so focused in on the moment that the larger shape doesn't make sense, right? So I've gotten into the habit of, because I'm really impatient and industrious and I just want to get the piece of music written, so it's hard for me to do this, but I've forced myself to, anytime I enact a new musical change, listen to the piece from the very beginning, if not from the beginning of the section, if not the very beginning, to hear how it sounds in context, right? Because to a certain extent, you can't know whether or not something is right until you see it inside the entire context, right? So when I write, I tend to write 1 bar at a time, although I have a larger sort of conception. I've got a sort of blueprint in my head that's longer than 1 bar at a time, but then I'm manifesting that self in detail 1 bar at a time. But then once I get like 3 or 4 or 5 bars, then, I'll go back and listen to it from the beginning and see if it works in context. In addition to focusing on, if you're working on counterpoint, you can just, play those bars over and over and over again. But once you finished, you have to go back and in order to know whether or not it fits the larger framework. I don't do a lot of editing. I'm really perfectionistic, and so I just write the piece of music sort of from beginning to end. And I'll go back and fix technical details, like if I show it to a composition instructor and they're like, that's not really playable. But as far as the notes are concerned, like I'm so detail-oriented that I very rarely will go to the finish and then go back and fix the notes, right? Because I try to get it as close to I can, as close to, I don't want to say perfection, but as close to my conception of what it should be given my intellectual capacity at that given moment in my life writing this piece of music before I move on to the next bar. The thing that I think is interesting about symmetry and asymmetry is that rhythmically, asymmetry is sort of like anxious anxiety, right? Because our heartbeat is sort of, symmetrical. So if we go against that, it's sort of feel like we're teetering on the edge of chaos. Whereas symmetry and rhythm gives us a sense of relaxation and repose. But in pitch content, it's the exact opposite, right? Octatonicism, hexatonicism, the fully diminished seventh chord, the augmented chord, the whole tone scale. Those are symmetrical structures, and they sound anxious because it's like a formless sphere, right? Without any discerning features. You don't know what's up and what's down, right? The moment you add asymmetry, the moment you put something on that sphere, you can use it as a frame of reference to know. It's like the theory of relativity, right? So that's the thing. That's a weird dichotomy that I just discovered a couple of years ago, that asymmetry and meter and rhythm is anxiety or yin, right? And symmetry is yang, whereas it's the exact opposite in pitch. In pitch, symmetry is yin and asymmetry is yang, which is interesting. I don't know how to reconcile that, but where do you think film music is going? To a degree, film music is going to go where it's going to go. I think a lot of people, I think to some extent, I shouldn't say this because it really isn't true, but video games are where it's at. Put it that way. Okay. That being said, within the realm of film, I don't think there's necessarily anything wrong with like going away from the tunes, so to speak, because you can create a memorable score without having like just a concise little melody that you can hum and whistle. Although I like melodies like that. I'm not so much concerned with the lack of melodicism as I am concerned with the lack of quality and the cookie cutter churning out of scores. But it used to be like that back with the studio system. Back with the studio system, there were points in time where everyone released this new musical, and every single musical that came out, they just churn these things out, had the same, right? There are a billion different variations of that little type of thing that you can come up with, and there were a billion, back in the 40s and 30s. And then Bernard Herrmann came along and tried experimental things, and sort of, So there are. I do think we're at a moment where film, it has to sort of break, and I think the indie film industry is kind of build up in its wake, or video games will build up its wake. Video game industry is already better than the film industry. There's a lot of great music being made in video games, but there's still a lot of great music being made in film. I think one shouldn't become overly concerned with, it goes back to the whole conception thing. If you, to use a kind of contrived analogy, if you are expecting a bowl of ice cream and someone hands you a bowl of soup and they tell you it's a bowl of ice cream, you'd be like, what is this? This is like rancid ice cream. And then they're like, no, it's soup. You're like, oh, okay. Oh, it's actually pretty good soup, right? It's not good ice cream, but it's good soup. So if you have a conception of what you think a film score should be, and it's John Williams, James Newton Howard, John Powell, then you're going to be disappointed, right? But that doesn't mean that there isn't good and bad music, but just don't conflate the quality of emotional expression and originality, which are two different things, with whether or not you are expecting the music to be something that it isn't trying to be. Can you play Michael Jackson, Peter? It's kind of hard to find this. Isn't that bad? Once you initiate it, it's fine, but Here it's fine, but once you get any lower than that, there's a if you articulate it too hard, there's a it's kind of similar to a reed instrument actually, because there are little metal reeds in that. It's like a harmonica. The little reeds vibrating. It's kind of like trying to articulate low on an oboe. Obviously, oboe is much more difficult. Oh, thanks, Charlie. I'm really glad you enjoyed that. I need to make more videos because I've developed a theory, and there are lots of other things that I've thought about and corrections to the old videos and building on that. I just again, I love college, I really do, but I legitimately it does not give me any time. College and students that are required for me to financially support myself, in addition to musical projects, just does not give me time to write music. And this past Christmas, I was hoping to make videos, but I ended up having technological issues with my mobile rig, and so I couldn't make videos I was trying to make at least one video, but I couldn't. So, but again, I graduate in May, so I will be making lots more videos because I will finally have free time. But there are a lot that I have planned in the works. Yeah, like I said, Joskin, earlier, I'll do an analysis of Symphony 1 when it's finished. You know the approximate length of the piece you're writing. Do you map out the structure in any way? If so, how? Yeah, I do kind of map out the structure. Again, it's like I talked about earlier. To me, it's sort of like the very, very loose, amorphous kind of psychological, emotional things, and then try to turn that into a narrative of some kind. It doesn't have to be like a specific narrative, but it can be just sort of a general archetypal narrative. And then I will go and write the piece of music, right? And it's different because if you're writing for a commission, if someone commissions you for 10 minutes, generally commissions are like 8 to 10 minutes, right? 10 to 12 minutes, 5 to 6 minutes. And so you don't have to worry so much about hitting exactly, and you can let the music sort of breathe and then kind of get to a place, and maybe it's 5.5 minutes, maybe it's 6 minutes and 10 seconds, but they're not going to kill you, right? It's fine. Whereas if you're writing for a film, everything needs to be exactly to fit every single solitary thing. The music has to be perfect, right? So that's why when you're writing music for film, you have to plan all the sync points ahead of time and get that in place before you write the music, right? Whereas if you're writing a commission, and part of that just comes with experience, right? And I didn't used to have a sense, but now I have a sense of the amount of thematic material that I can fit in a given length of time. So I know that if I'm brainstorming a piece of music that's supposed to be 3 or 4 minutes long, I know if I've got like 4 or 5 motives that this is probably too much material to really sufficiently develop in this period of time. And so I've kind of learned to be a bit more economical. Whereas if you have like a 30-minute piece of music, then you have a lot more time and a larger scale. You can develop things more subtly, right? If you read like a short little novel or manga, it's action-packed and full of things and short little things and this and that. Or if you watch a film short, it has one focus the whole time. And there's one arc, little narrative, and then problem, and then the problem resolves itself. That's it, right? Whereas if you're reading a larger novel, there are multiple problems and sub problems that resolve themselves, but then another problem arises, and you can get much more complex and subtle and larger scale. And you don't have to be so worried about grabbing your audience's attention from the very beginning. And that's, I think, the issue with a lot of people coming to classical music for the first time. They go to listen to a Mahler symphony, and it starts out, and they're like, I'm bored. It's like, well, this isn't a pop song, that you put on and listen to as wallpaper music with lyrics driving its semantic content with the same chord progression over and over again, that has a waveform that looks like this, that has a consistent beat, right? That you immediately can understand that it's like every other piece you've listened to, and you like that because it's just exactly what you want. And there's good pop music. I'm being ungrateful. I'm straw manning pop music, but if you go to a Mahler symphony, you need to. It's like carving out time. If you're reading Lord of the Rings, you can't just sit down and read a sentence and then go do something else, right? You have to carve out time to sit down, relax, get some tea, and then read. And the larger the amount of time you can sit down and read, the larger amount of chapters, the more engrossed you can get into it, because it's something that's deeper and more subtle than not that there's anything wrong with manga or something that's short and sweet and to the point, like a great fanfare, but they're just different mediums. That's actually an excellent point that Charlie says. You can't have John Williams without a new Spielberg. You can't have a new John Williams without a new Spielberg, and there clearly isn't one of those in the block currently. That's an excellent point. There are many, many. The climate of directors nowadays is realism, sound design, and really pushing the envelope, and ambient music, and those types of things are really in vogue currently. So even if there are great composers out there who want to go in film music and write John Williams type music, maybe the film directors aren't letting them write it because it just isn't the aesthetic that they want, right? And again, I don't necessarily want to demonize either the composers or the directors, because there's some. I'm not a determinist, but there's some deterministic extent to which the industry is just going to do what it's going to do, and you can't sort of be like, oh, the world is going to crap because no one's writing John Williams scores. No, it's an industry, and it's a constantly evolving and changing art form, and it gets to a point where it's sort of the Tower of Babel, and then the languages get split, right? And then everyone sort of builds their civilizations, and then the flood comes, right? And it's like anything. You get these moments in an art form where things build and then sort of become tyrannical, and then people break it apart. It happens in history. It's happened in music, and so we are also ensconced in the current climate and environment of our era, and it's so viscerally real to us that we often forget the fact that this isn't an apocalypse. This isn't the apocalypse. It is one of many apocalypses which continue to happen throughout the ages. And so, not that one as a composer shouldn't try and advocate for change, but it's gonna happen regardless. How do I start breaking this habit when arranging off of source music? You mean like temp tracks and stuff? Try and abstract from the music what the director likes, and then change everything else, right? That would be my piece of advice. So when the director chooses a piece of source music, often the composer thinks, okay, sometimes they map it on and they edit it to it, and it's just like temp love as everyone. But that's the degree to which that has been overly demonized, and the composer who manages to convince the director that the temp track is all wrong, darn it, I'm gonna make good art, where is kind of romanticized, and it doesn't really, it isn't favorable to what the director's perspective is. So what I would say is, when you're working with, I'm assuming you're talking about like some kind of director, like for media music. If you're not, let me know. But if you're writing music based off a temp track, talk to the director and figure out what do they like about it, right? Because one thing that I've noticed that's interesting is that composers and musicians tend to holistically think about all the parameters of music. They listen to a piece of music, and whether or not it reminds them of another piece of music, in order to figure out whether or not it reminds them of another piece of music, they take into account melody, rhythm, timbre, harmony, counterpoint, all of these different things, right? Form. And if a piece of music has like some sort of trumpet fanfare, which is totally different from another piece of music, but it has trumpets, they might think, oh yeah, that reminds me of that. Just the timbre reminds me of that. But then they listen to a piece of music which is totally timbrally different, but it has a similar harmonic language. They'll be like, God, that reminds me of that harmonically. But the non-musician has great difficulty separating those parameters because they don't have the language. It's something they can't hear it. They can hear it. Most people, non-musicians, have generally good musical ears, right? People have a much greater capacity to be musically sensitive and good musicians than most people realize, right? They just don't have the language, the jargon to express it. So what, I'll give you a specific example, and I think I've told this anecdote before, so if you've heard this anecdote on a previous stream, forgive me, but I was working on the soundtrack for a video game a while back, and I won't name it because I don't want to cast aspersions on the director, but I was writing an ambient piece of music, and it had some synth pads in the background and little sound effects and a clarinet solo. And the director came to me and said, I like this, but it sounds too medieval. And I was like, okay, what do you mean by that? And he says, I don't know, it just sounds too medieval. And I was like, okay, let's do a little psychoanalysis. What could he mean by that? Maybe he thinks that it's too melodic, and sort of the extroverted melodicism reminds you of kind of like the medieval scores, and maybe he wants something that's a bit more subtle. Maybe the harmonic language is too modal. Maybe if the harmonic language had a bit gruffer sonorities, maybe some octatonicism, maybe something that fourths and fifths, chordal, quintal harmony, or just something. Maybe it was too modal, right? Because I think I did have like a Dorian melody. I was like, maybe the Dorian sounds kind of modal, the Dorian sounds kind of medieval to him because he's heard the Dorian mode in medieval soundtracks, and that's kind of, maybe that's the case, right? Maybe there's something about it timbrally. So I tried out different revisions, right? So I went to him and I said, okay, I made it less melodic. I tried. He's like, no, it still sounds medieval, right? So then I changed it harmonically. He's like, no, it still sounds medieval. So I went through a series of these revisions until finally I removed the clarinet and replaced it with a flute. And he's like, that sounds great. That's exactly what I want. What'd you do? And I said, I removed the clarinet. He said, is that what that instrument is? Yeah, that sounds medieval to me. The clarinet to him sounded medieval, right? And as a composer, we can be cynical and be like, well, you know, you're foolish. You know, you like the clarinet doesn't sound medieval. You're an idiot, right? But regardless of whether or not the clarinet objectively sounds like it's medieval, you're working for a director, and the fact that they think it sounds like a clarinet is an objective fact. The fact that they think that it's real to them, and because they're human and other people are human and other directors are human and they've grown up with similar experiences, maybe they're just weird and they think a clarinet is medieval. But there could be a degree to which people who are making this film and people who are watching the film might think the clarinet sounds medieval, and maybe it isn't the right aesthetic choice, right? So we have a tendency to think as composers that we're such musical experts that we always know what the right aesthetic decisions are. But we can get so focused in and so biased towards and connected to the various facets of music that we lose sight of what it's like to be a non-musician. And we got to remember that we're writing music, generally speaking, for non-musicians, right? I'm not necessarily stating that I think that to remove the clarinet was the right or wrong decision. That's irrelevant. All that I'm saying, yeah, I know, yeah, about the Baroque. But all that I'm saying is that if you're trying to figure out how to be as creative as possible within the confines of a temp track, because that's the thing, right? It was that specifically that he didn't like, and so you could invert the argument. It's the same thing. You could say that a director wants one thing in a cue, and as long as you give them that thing, you can do something else. Like someone comes to you and says, I want Inception, time from Inception. Well, they might want the chord progression, right? Or they might just want the pulsating kind of, melancholy sound. If you figure out which one of those, if you can boil it down to specific things, if you know what they want, you can give them what they want, but then change every other parameter, change the rhythm, change this, change that. And John Williams is excellent at that, right? There are some moments in which he just sort of rips off the temp track because it works really well for the film, and it's, fair enough. But especially later on in his career, there are moments at which John Williams obviously is inspired by some aspect of the temp track, but he changes everything else, right? Like people often say, the Howard Hanson Symphony, Howard Hanson's Romantic Symphony. People often think that is, right? And there are some similarities. There's a woodwind flourish ostinato, right? There's the fact that it's in the Lydian mode, and there's the fact that there's a horn motive that comes in and plays a call that focuses on the interval of fifths, right? Right? But beyond those similarities, everything about the cue is different. The cue develops in a different way. The melody is different. Different textures arise from that. Different harmonic language, utilizing the flat sixth chord instead of just sticking with diatonic. So it's all about, and I think, figuring out exactly what your director wants, specifically with regards to musical parameters, and then giving them that, but then changing everything else to be creative. Oh yeah, sorry if I skipped that. How do counterpoint rules change from the Baroque to the Romantic period? Well, it's sort of the same thing that happens from the Baroque period, from the Renaissance period to the Baroque period, but just to a greater extent, right? And it has to do with the liberation of dissonance, but not necessarily free dissonance. That happens in the modernism period, the earlier 20th century. But what happens is, the Baroque period basically said we can allow a greater level of let me start back. Renaissance music, let's compose individual lines, and we have specific intervals that we think sound consonant, and there are certain intervals which are dissonant but acceptable as long as they are resolved in a way that is melodically coherent. Gives us the relaxation. Vertical sonority is resulted from that, right? Like the 5-1 Ti do re do, 5-7 going to 1 is something that naturally resulted from voice leading process of the modal counterpoint of the Renaissance, right? The clausula vera is what they would call that. And then that gradually became abstracted into a specific vertical sonority. So the horizontal beget the vertical, and then the vertical was abstracted and then used without the horizontal, right? And then because of the fact that the vertical, they were then able to manipulate in lots of different keys. You know, you can have 5-1, but except 5 of 2 going to 1, secondary dominance and all those types of things. And the harmonic language, the vertical language of functional harmony, became more sophisticated. You could have a higher level of surface level dissonance because there's this pillar structure of the harmony that's sort of holding it all together. And it's the same thing. The same thing sort of reverses itself in the Romantic period. The Romantic period, you started to lose the sense of functional harmony, but so well, in other words, the vertical sonorities in the Baroque period gave rise to new horizontal combinations that wouldn't have been possible before. But then those horizontal combinations were abstracted, and then they became a thing and were focused on in the Romantic period. I didn't explain that particularly well, but what I mean is that if you look at like Chopin nocturnes, for example, there's some functional harmony, but there's also harmony which is sheerly a result of voice leading, right? Where I have, you know, where is my melodic, you know, where I have right? And if you look at all that individually, you can't really say any of that is 5-1, but it's all very parsimonious, smooth voice leading, and to some extent it is abstraction of 5-1. So, you know, I could say this. Okay, so it's like, okay, 1 going to 6. Cool, now we can add a secondary dominant. Cool, now I can make it parsimonious voice leading and just keep the C. Right? Then add detail. Right? Now we're like in French Impressionism. But then we can say, okay, well, this augmented chord is a symmetrical sonority, so it's uninvertible, which means by inference that any change you make to a given note of the chord can be applied to any other note of the chord. It's like it's like your 3 twin brothers or sisters. So I can go to A minor, but we can abstract from this and say that any augmented chord, when you move a note up from a half step, gives you a minor chord, right? So I can go from this. I move this up a half step, I get A minor, as we know, but I can also move this note up a half step, and then we get F minor, right? I move this note up a half step, we get C sharp minor, right? And then you add the details, right? Right? And you get all these harmonic variety in the surface level, and it gets to the point that you can't draw a line back to the original progression. But it still works because it's ultimately an abstraction of that progression. And that's really where the Romantic period has. And where the Romantic period broke into atonality is when it got to the point where you couldn't recognize the connection to tonality. At that point, they were like, well, you know what? We might as well just build a whole new system, right? Because we sort of reached the peak limit of philosophy. But regardless, hopefully that answers your question a little bit. Yeah, studios and producers definitely play it very safe. That's why I'm a big fan of the indie film industry and the indie gaming industry. What's your favorite era in classical music? French Impressionism. Great, awesome. Well, at least for now. Too bad. My voice is dying and I'm starving. Hopefully that was enjoyable for you all. Sorry if I talked super fast and you couldn't understand it. Hopefully you can slow it down. As always, if there's something that I said that you just literally can't understand what I said, in the comments and I'll clarify with what I said. In any case, I hope you guys all enjoyed this. Thanks so much for showing up. We got a great turnout, lots of good questions. And thank you so much for your subscriptions. I really appreciate it. Again, just to reiterate, just to plug, if any of you are interested in Zoom or Skype lessons, just let me know in email. And if any of you have questions about anything, let me know. Also in email, I'll try to answer them. Although it's hard because I do get a lot of questions. If you want your questions to have priority, then just become a patron. I think it's the $3 limit, and then you get access to an email address that I check every day. and not a lot of people use it, right? So if you become a $3 patron and then use email address to ask me questions, it's very likely that you'll get an answer very quickly. I try to prioritize that. So thanks so much. Adios.